Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martina Lawless. I'm the director of the ESRI, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's webinar. I'd like to welcome everyone to our launch of this report on deprived children in Ireland, characterising those who are deprived but not income poor. And that's by three ESRI authors, Helen Russell, Eva Slevin, and Bertrand Mage. The work is funded by a research programme between the ESRI and the Department of Children, Disability and Equality. So we'd of course like to thank them for their support. The structure of this afternoon's event is we'll first have a presentation of the report's overall findings on this important topic, which I think brings a nice new layer of nuance into how we identify child poverty, because that's such an essential foundation for developing policy interventions to tackle the issue. Then after the presentation, we'll have some responses from a panel with very considerable expertise in this area. Dr. Naomi Feely, who's the Senior Research and Policy Manager for the Children's Rights Alliance, Stephen Moffat, who's the National Policy Manager for Bernardo's, and Dr. Anne-Marie McGowan from the Child Poverty Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach. So finally, we should have time to take some questions at the end. So people are free to submit those into the chat function at any time, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. So I'll now hand over to Helen to present the findings of the report.
Thank you very much, Martina, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming along this afternoon. So my name's Helen Russell, and I'm going to do the first part of the presentation, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Eva Slevin. So we're also presenting on behalf of our colleague Bertrand, who'll be here to answer questions as well. And I'd like to echo Martina's thanks to the Department of Children, Disability and Equality, and especially the members of the steering group for the project, and also to the CSO for giving us access to the data that we've used for the study. As you can see from the title, so we're focusing on deprived children, and particularly on children who are deprived but are not income poor. And I'll explain those in detail as we go along now. Next slide, please. Eva, you can move those. Thank you. Yes, so we'll start with the motivation for the study. I see something up on the screen. Does everyone else see that?
No, it's clear.
It's clear. Okay, sorry, there's something popped up on mine. Okay, so in terms of why we're looking at this study, first of all, child poverty has wide-ranging and long-lasting impacts, and Irish policy recognises the multidimensional nature of poverty, in that it uses a measure of consistent poverty, which combines an income measure, which is at risk of poverty, and a measure of material deprivation. And I'll go into more details about this. I suppose social policy really focuses in particular on income and addressing low income, and on consistent poverty. And that's the measure that we use for our official poverty measures and for poverty targets, and probably a little less attention on deprivation in its own right. Next slide, please. So the at risk of poverty measure, which is the income poverty measure, is as follows. So a household is defined as at risk of poverty if their equivalized disposable income is less than 60% of the national median. And the equivalized means that it's adjusted for the size and composition of the household. The measure of deprivation is one that probably a lot of you are familiar with as well. So it's also known as material deprivation. So a household is deprived if they cannot afford 2 or more goods or services from a list of 11 items, which are considered to be necessities for society. And that includes things like being unable to heat their home, being unable to afford new clothes rather than second-hand clothes, and a range of items like that. And as I said, consistent poverty is the combination of those two measures. So a household is consistently poor if they are both at risk of poverty and deprived. So in this study, we're identifying 4 groups of children. And you'll see here we've got a Venn diagram, I suppose. So what the left-hand circle is the at risk of poverty, and the right-hand circle is the deprived group. And we can see where these overlap in the middle are the children that are in consistent poverty. So they're both at risk of poverty and deprived. And then on the right-hand side, which we've colored in green here, is the group that we're particularly focused on. So they're deprived, but they're not at risk of poverty. And then these all sit in this wider group of children, which is neither deprived nor at risk of poverty. So why might individuals be deprived but not income poor, so not below the poverty line? Well, for some households, it may be that their income is just above the threshold that we use, maybe just above that 60% threshold. So they have still got relatively low income, and therefore their standard of living, as measured by the deprivation, is still low. It may be that that households have additional needs or costs. So that, for example, there's somebody living with a disability in the household, which we know leads to higher costs, or a household may be living may have very high housing costs. So again, that means that they cannot spend their income on other necessities. Another reason identified in the literature is that households may have higher levels of accumulated debt, or they may lack savings or resources to draw on. So we consider also these are potentially a vulnerable group because they're lacking these basic necessities for an adequate standard of living. So the research questions we're focusing are first of all, which children are deprived but not income poor? What are their characteristics? Secondly, how does the size of this group change if we alter the measurement of income poverty? So for example, if we change the income threshold, or if we adjust for housing costs. And then thirdly, we're interested in looking how the experiences of these children, whether they differ from those children who are in consistent poverty. So how do we go about doing this? Well, the data that we use comes from the survey of income and living conditions, and this is an annual survey. It has about 5,000 private households each year. For most of the analysis, we combine 2022 and 2023, and this is because some of those categories that we're looking at are quite small, so we want to have sufficient numbers to look at that in detail. We have a sample of just under 5,000 children, so all of those aged under 18 years in 2022 and 2023. The analysis is cross-sectional, so we're not following the same people over time or anything like that. So we can't get at causality. And the main model results is from a multinomial logistic regression. So in terms of the key findings, first of all, if we look at the size of these groups for the 2022-2023 year, so combined, so we see consistent poverty here in the middle. So this is children who are deprived and income poor. That's just under 6% of the child population. The group in green here, that is our group of interest, is the deprived, not at risk of poverty, is about 14%. And then we have the other group over here, which is they are at risk of poverty, so their income is below the poverty line, but they're not deprived. And then the larger majority of children are neither deprived nor at risk of poverty. So how does this change over time? So this graph shows these 4 different categories over the period 2004 to 2023. And the group of interest here are the orange, so that's our deprived, not at risk of poverty. So we can see that over the period, the proportion of children who are deprived but not income poor increased over the period of the recession here from 2010 to 2015. So that we had a bigger proportion falling into that category at that time. The lighter blue squares on top are the children that are in consistent poverty, and you can see that also increased with the in the same period during the recession. And then if we look at the numbers deprived, not at risk of poverty, then decreased a bit during the from 2015 onwards, but then has increased again in this latest period, 2022 to 2023, up from 11% to 17%. Okay. So what happens to these groups and the percentage of children falling into these categories if we adjust the income thresholds? So you can see here on the left hand side, the bar there is where we use the standard poverty threshold. So that's 60% of median income. Again, our group of interest here is marked in orange. So that's the deprived, not at risk of poverty group. And you can see on the measure, as we saw in the previous slide, 14% of children fall into this category. And then the group on top, the 5.9%, is the consistently poor. So if we instead impose a poverty threshold at 70% of median income, we see that the orange part of the bar declines to 9.6%. And so the children are moving from this deprived, not income poor, into the consistently poor category. So there's a much bigger proportion then who are consistently poor at 10.5% of the group. Again, if we widen that further and increase the threshold to 80%, an even bigger proportion of the children move from being deprived, not income poor, into the consistently poor group. So what this shows us really is that actually 1/3 of this group of interest have incomes that are between 60% and 70% of median income, and then about another 20% have incomes that are between 70% and 80%. So half of them are between 60% and 80% of median income. So that's really, I think, accounting for a good deal of why these children are deprived, is that their households are really not very far above the income threshold. So if you move to the next one. So what happens if instead we adjust the income for housing costs? So in this graph, we're comparing the groups when we have before housing costs, which is the standard way of calculating income, and after housing costs. And you've seen here, we've highlighted again the group that are deprived but not at risk of poverty. And we see before housing costs, as we saw in all the previous slide, we have 14%. If we adjust for housing costs, this declines to 8.6%. And instead, these children are then moving into the consistently poor category. So we see the consistent poverty goes up from, it almost doubles from 6% to 11.5%. So again, we can see from this that about 40% of this group, the deprived, not AROP, are actually in households that have relatively high housing costs that that is likely to be affecting their standard of living. So, next slide. We're going to now move over to Eva, who's going to take us through the remaining findings.
Thank you, Helen. Hi, I'm Eva Slevin. I'm the research assistant on this project. So I'm going to walk you through our findings and some of our conclusions. And it's suddenly stopped working for me. There we go. So firstly, we looked at the characteristics of children in the different poverty groups. On the x-axis here, we have the characteristics we're interested in, and the y-axis shows the percentage. The deprived, not at risk of poverty group is going to be in orange, and that'll consist throughout the graphs. So how we should read this is the y-axis shows the percentage of children in a given poverty category that have this specific characteristic. So for example, 41% of children classified as deprived but not at risk of poverty are living in lone parent households, while 31% of the consistently poor group in that dark grey colour there are living in lone parent households. And we're really interested in whether the deprived, not at risk of poverty group differs in characteristics from the other poverty groups, particularly the consistently poor group. And that's both materially deprived and income poor, just to remind you. So for household disability status, the proportions of those in the deprived, not at risk of poverty group and consistently poor group who are living with at least one adult with a disability are similarly high at 42 and 44% compared to 24% for the at risk of poverty, not deprived group. And then for the remaining characteristics that we look at here, children in consistent poverty have larger proportions of the household head born outside of Ireland or without a job, and the deprived, not at risk of poverty group sees similar proportions to the at risk of poverty, not deprived group here. In all cases, these at-risk characteristics see much higher proportions within the poverty groups compared to neither deprived nor at risk of poverty. So then here we have the results of our multinomial logistic regression that Helen mentioned earlier. So this shows the relative risks of being in each poverty category compared to being neither deprived nor at risk of poverty for each characteristic. The deprived, not at risk of poverty group is in red, that's the red triangles, and the reference category for each characteristic is also in red on the y-axis here. So the y-axis shows the outcome variable of interest. The x-axis shows the relative risk ratios for each poverty group, and you should read it horizontally along the grid lines. If a coefficient isn't significant, we don't include it here. So if you don't see a red triangle, the deprived, not at risk of poverty group is not significant, as in the age and number of children categories at the top there. So lone parent status is significant across all poverty categories. What this means is that children in lone parent households have a greater risk of being in any category of poverty compared to two-parent households, but they're particularly at risk of material deprivation. Children in lone parent families are 8.6 times more likely to be deprived, not at risk of poverty, compared to children in two-parent households. Then for disability status, circled here, which is having at least one adult in the family with a disability. Those in this situation have twice the risk of being deprived, not at risk of poverty, or consistent poverty compared to those not living with any adults with a disability. And this would be expected from what we saw in the previous slide. The deprived, not at risk of poverty group is significant for all remaining variables. Where there's increased risk for children in these categories of experiencing deprivation, though the risk is often higher for those experiencing income poverty in addition to deprivation. The household reference person, so that's the person in charge of the household or the head of household, their educational status is significant for all three poverty categories, where children in households where the parent has lower educational attainment are around 3 times more likely to be characterized as deprived, not at risk of poverty, compared to children with a third-level educated household reference person. For children with a household reference person born outside of Ireland, there's also an elevated risk of poverty at just over, at just over 3 times the likelihood. They're 3 times more likely to be characterized as deprived, not at risk of poverty, compared to children with a third level. Sorry, that's 3 times the likelihood of being categorized as deprived, not at risk of poverty, compared to those with their household reference person born in Ireland. So overall, this illustrates, as in the previous graphs, the substantial risks of poverty experienced by these groups. So then we were interested in the actual experiences of these children living in different poverty categories. So this graph shows several indicators of financial strain. These questions are asked to the head of household. The deprived not at risk of poverty group is again in orange, and the stars that we see here refers to whether the proportion seen for deprived not at risk of poverty is significantly different to the consistently poor group, and that's again in that dark grey. There's no consistently poor bar for the second characteristic here, the unable to face unexpected expenses. That's due to statistical disclosure rules. So there's a linear increase in the proportion of children in each poverty category living in households experiencing difficulties making ends meet. The deprived not at risk of poverty group falls between the at risk of poverty, not deprived group and the consistently poor group here. And then a similar trend can be seen in the unable to face an unexpected expense variable, with over 80% of the deprived not at risk of poverty group living in households that are unable to meet an unexpected expense. Nearly all of the consistently poor group experience this, which is why we can't, that's, so that kind of shows that linear increase. This really reflects the financial strain that these households are experiencing. For the percentage in arrears, this combines arrears on utility bills, mortgage, rent, and hire purchase. And here we can see there's the same level as consistently poor. It's not a significant difference, but we do see a much higher percentage of both of these categories experiencing arrears compared to, say, just at risk of poverty, not deprived. There's 50% are say that non-housing, just under 50%, sorry, say non-housing loans are a burden, which is double the proportion seen in the two other poverty categories. So this is a subjective measure, but it's whether they're finding these non-housing loans to be a burden. There's no difference in the proportion of households paying more than 30% of income on housing, so there's no significant difference between the consistently poor group and the deprived not at risk of poverty group. And then a somewhat lower percentage are dependent on social transfers. So more than 50% of their income is coming from these compared to the consistently poor group. Then we looked at financial and life dissatisfaction. And here we're talking about the life and financial dissatisfaction of the household reference person. So not the child, but this is where a child is living in a household where their head of household is extremely dissatisfied. Well, is less than 5%, less than 5 on a 10-point scale. So we see that levels of life dissatisfaction is the same for the household reference person in both the deprived, not at risk of poverty, and the consistent poverty categories. Dissatisfaction with the financial situation is higher across all three poverty categories, so across at risk of poverty, not deprived, deprived, not at risk of poverty, and consistent poverty. And nearly 2/3 of the deprived, not at risk of poverty are saying that they're financially dissatisfied, and this is higher again in the consistently poor group. And it's interesting that it is higher than the solely income poor group. These are measured at the same time and are correlations and not causal relationships. So this would be measured at the same time as them experiencing this income poverty and deprivation. So for some conclusions, the key takeaways, the number of deprived not at risk of poverty children is increasing in the recent period from a decrease that we saw in that first graph. And many of these children are just above the poverty line. So 1/3 of the group have incomes between 60 and 70% of the median income, and nearly 50% have incomes between 60 and 80% of the median. A high proportion of these have high housing costs. So when we do adjust the housing costs, the income to account for housing costs, 40% move into the consistently poor group. And many of these have arrears or non-housing debts that are impacting on their standard of living. The deprived not at risk of poverty group share key risk factors with consistently poor group, particularly those who are in lone parenthood, living in households, in lone parent households, living in households with others with a disability. And they're experiencing many similar experiences to the consistently poor group, which shows the vulnerability of this group. So the kind of implications for measurement, future poverty measurement should maybe consider a range of income thresholds. What we've done here is highlighting the implications of different choices on the proportions categorized into each poverty category. And it also identifies those at risk of becoming consistently poor, particularly as the risk factors are similar for these groups. Adjusting income measures for housing costs can better reflect the impact of the current housing crisis on the standard of living in Irish households. In terms of policy implications, a lot of targeted policy measures are based on low income. So these supports are really, really important, but they are likely to miss some vulnerable groups, particularly the deprived groups. Universal services, for example, the free healthcare for children as envisaged by Sláintecare, or policies targeted at deprived areas like DEIS or SICAP will reach the deprived not at risk of poverty group. We also need to avoid cliff edges in tax and welfare, which is the tapering of income supports to support those slightly above the threshold, so an increase in income does not push them over that threshold for receiving support. Efforts to address child poverty need to address the substantial risks faced by lone parents and people with a disability. And to do this, a multifaceted policy approach is required to reach these children experiencing deprivation who are such a vulnerable group. Thank you. Any questions or comments are welcome.
Thanks very much to you both. So we'll pass on for some responses to our panel now. Maybe I could ask Dr. Naomi Feely from the Children's Rights Alliance to kick off the responses.
Thanks a million, Martina, and congratulations to Helen, Eva, and Bertrand. I think this is just a really excellent piece of research. I suppose if I have one key takeaway is that I really want to take away this report and labor over it for quite some time, because I think there's so much rich data contained in it that is really beneficial in terms of trying to inform evidence-based policy making. I suppose just some kind of general comments on the report. When we think of this idea about children who are experiencing deprivation but are not at risk of poverty, immediately what comes to mind for me is the need for us to invest in those services that can really break the cycle of poverty and disadvantage. And I know Eva mentioned these at the end of her presentation around looking at universal measures such as investing in things like hot school meals. Sometimes we're often asked the question as to why are we encouraging investment in measures that are providing hot school meals to families who perhaps don't need it, but actually we don't know who needs hot school meals or who doesn't. And we would certainly see that through our work on food poverty. Other measures as well that really spring to mind is when we look at the statistics around education and the impact that that has not only on the disproportionate number of children in consistent poverty in a household where the household reference person only had secondary level education, and also for the deprived, not at risk of poverty, but really investing in ensuring that our education system can enable all children to reach their full potential. So certainly for us in Budget 2026, we'd like to see, investment in measures such as the expansion of the DEIS Plus model, which is currently being developed to really tackle high levels of disadvantage that children are experiencing. But we even saw, over a decade ago, research done by the ASRI, which highlighted that actually 50% of children in non-DEIS schools were experiencing poverty. So it's really important that our policy responses are flexible, that they don't just look at income as the main identifier of if a child is living in poverty or experiencing deprivation. Another couple of key points that I did take from the report was the issue around older children. I think there's really good data there that really supports advocacy within our sector to encourage increases in income supports for children who are older. The data shows in the report that an overrepresentation of older children in the consistent poverty rate, but actually there's some interesting data around 5 to 11-year-olds who are overrepresented in the deprived but not at risk of poverty rate. So there's really, really good evidence, rich evidence there for NGOs within the sector advocating around the budget, but particularly for policymakers, so that when they are responding to the issue of child poverty, they're really taking a full understanding of the experience of child poverty for children and families right across Ireland. I think the data as well on the number of children in families and the impact that that has on experiences of poverty is really critical. I know that colleagues in Trinity College, UCD, have recently done a lot of work around larger families and the impact that poverty is having on them. So really rich data there to look at specific policy responses that can be that can address these levels of data. I suppose that just one final point I really think one of the most interesting pieces of analysis, and Helen referred to this in her presentation, and Eva, towards the end, is when you do look at adjusting the measure of at risk of poverty. So whether looking at it as 70% of median income or 80% of median income, you know, the number of children that are actually just on that threshold of poverty. I do wonder what the repeat of this analysis would look like with the Silk 2024 data. Certainly last week when we launched the Child Poverty Monitor, we were highlighting that the 2024 data shows that an additional 45,000 children were living in consistent poverty. So it would be interesting to see, is that finding around the proportion of children who are between 60% and 80% of the median income, really around that threshold, are they the ones that have now been pulled into consistent poverty in Silk 2024? And finally, just a small point on the measure looking at before and after housing costs. I think that that's really critical as well. We can see the impact that the affordability within the housing sector is having on families and on pulling children and families into poverty. But really, I suppose, trying to understand that as just one measure of understanding the impact of the housing crisis on families. We know from data that we looked at for the Child Poverty Monitor, there is an increased issue around overcrowding, with 11% of children living in households, in income poor households, living in overcrowded accommodation in 2021, but in 2024 this had doubled to 22%. So there is a lot more to, I think, consider around the housing issue and the impact that housing is having on child poverty and children's health and well-being. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much there, Naomi. And I think that's a really good point at the end on the not just the cost of housing, but its adequacy. And I think Helen has looked at that in some previous work. So could I now ask Stephen Moffat to come in to make his response? So Stephen is from Bernardo's.
Well, thanks so much for getting me to come on. This is a really brilliant piece of work. I actually chatted to colleagues about a year or so ago based on about an OECD report that actually touched on this issue about people living in or experiencing deprivation or going without essential items, but in households where the incomes were technically sufficient. So it's brilliant to have, you know, Irish data on this now. From ourselves in Bernardo's, it's something we've probably witnessed over the last number of years, and probably growing. You know, I suppose we've always witnessed a certain extent of it, but we've seen it grow over the past couple of years. What we've seen is that parents who had probably been doing okay, keeping their heads above water, you know, struggling that little bit more, but also more and more parents saying, we don't understand why we're struggling. We don't understand why we're not providing children with essentials. We both of us have incomes. We think we should be, you know, and getting, you know, within our project sort of saying to staff, we don't understand why we can't give our children this. We're both working. We think we should have enough income, but it's not covering what our costs are. You know, and we've seen that. We've also seen through a lot of our surveys that we've run over the last number of years, more and more parents sort of really feeling unjustifiably above thresholds. So we'd see that and say back to school clothing, footwear allowance, you know, parents saying, why aren't we entitled to that? We're really struggling with these costs, but because of X, Y, Z, we're just missing out on it. So it's something, you know, definitely reflective of what we've seen in our services, but also something we need to go away and really sort of look into that in more detail. Because sometimes I think even within our own services, we have, you know, when we look at financial difficulties, sometimes we can really sort of think the threshold is higher than what it should be. I think the biggest takeaway for me from this report is really the outcomes. I mean, the fact that, you know, you have children living in those homes, it means that there's households where there's worse health, or worse physical health, worse mental health, lower life satisfaction, lower standard of living. That's a huge implication in terms of how we look at policies, because ultimately we want to be having children living in homes where there's, you know, equal opportunities. Well, if they're living in households in which, you know, all those outcomes are much worse, disproportionately worse, we need to be trying to target that. So this is really strong evidence showing that, look, looking at risk of poverty is important, but it needs to be much more nuanced as we go forward, as more policies are developed. The government needs to really take that on board. Can't just look at one sort of measurement. We need to see the measurements that are actually looking at harm and damage to children and their childhoods, because, you know, as we say in Bernardo's, like, childhood lasts a lifetime. So this is really strong evidence for that. And it's something that people really need to go away and sort of dig into it in more and more detail about some of the correlation. I mean, it is really rich data. I mean, some of the points that jump off, we've always known that obviously lone parents are disproportionately impacted by poverty, but for them to be 8 times more likely, our children living in those homes, 8 times more likely to experience deprivation, but not be at risk of poverty, is really alarming. But again, at least it's evidence that we can show where, look, measures need to be taken. I'd echo what Naomi said as well about, you know, some universal measures that have been really positive over the last number of years, and the government needs to look where else can they expand those sorts of measures to take pressure off parents, and at the same time make sure that children are getting access to those items. So yes, as I said, it's a hugely rich piece of work that should have a lot of policy implications.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And the final respondent is Dr. Anne-Marie McGarn from the Child Poverty Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach.
Thank you very much, Martina, and congratulations to Eva, Helen and Bertrand on this analysis, which is really helpful. So I think our main takeaways echo some of those that have been raised by Stephen and Naomi. I think one thing that particularly struck me is the link between deprivation and housing costs. And the work of the SRI has begun to explore that link in the last few years. And now this is more confirmation that that is associated not just with poverty, but also with deprivation. It's useful to know that a very high proportion of these children are living in rental housing. And I wonder as well, is there any more detail about what kind of rental housing are they living in? Are they living in housing where they're getting support from HAP or ROS or other schemes? Or are they getting no support with their rental housing? I also found it very useful to know that there are many migrant children in this group. So we've seen some analysis from the SRI recently about the fact that children in migrant households have higher rates of poverty. So here we also see their higher rates of deprivation. And from a policy point of view, it's very useful to know that the risk factors for deprivation, either with or without income poverty, are the same, so that we know that measures that are targeting children who are deprived and income poor also reach those who are deprived and not income poor. So it's really useful, and we really welcome having this greater understanding of factors that contribute to deprivation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'd like to kind of encourage anybody in the audience now, if you want to put some questions into the Q&A function there, we can put them to the panelists or to the authors. Before doing that, maybe if Helen or any of the other authors would like to respond to the comments made by the discussants there.
Yeah, I might just respond to a few there. Yeah, so taking Anne-Marie's last point there about the housing tenure. So we have in the report, we didn't show it in the presentation there, the where the different groups are located in the housing market, and yeah, that group who are deprived but not at risk of poverty are more likely to be they're the group most likely to be in households that are paying market rent. So that means they're not receiving the HAP or any other supports, or they're not in social housing. So yeah, we do take that into account in looking at that, and they are overrepresented in that group that's been really exposed to those increases in housing costs. Yeah, I totally agree then with the points that Naomi you were making around the quality of housing as well is really important, and we've looked at that elsewhere, and that has really direct impacts on children's well-being as well, and their health. So I think that's really important. And yes, that point that Stephen is making about, are the about the children moving, or I think it was Naomi or Stephen about, are these groups then likely to be becoming consistently poor in the 2024 data onwards? And I think that is, that is part of the issue, that because they are just above the poverty threshold, they are a group that's quite likely then to, over time, then move into the consistent poverty. We're not able to follow people over time in the same way as we can, like with the Growing Up in Ireland survey. So you can't really follow most households, between the waves. But what we really thought, looking at the trends over time, is that it's almost like a precursor to a rise in this group of deprived, not income poor, is almost a precursor of then seeing a rise in consistent poverty. And that's what we saw this year in the latest figures. So it's like a predictor of what's going to happen in the following year. But yeah, I think the really important points that the panelists made about those universal services as well, that if things are being allocated on the basis of income alone, then you're going to miss important groups of children that are in need. And so we do have, as we've said, policies that do try and address that. But it's I think it's a really important an important point to make about those services as well, that they are reaching children in need.
Thanks very much, Alan. So just looking at the questions coming in now from the audience, we've got two questions about the availability of the slides and the full report. Certainly the full report is on the ESRI website. It should be on our front page, esri.ie, because it just came out today. Then there's a question on, there'll always need to be thresholds for schemes and services, and some people will always lose out. How do we manage the balance between this reality and supporting those just above the thresholds? So I guess both for the authors and maybe some of the panelists as well, if you have any thoughts on that.
I see Bertrand has his hand up. If you want to go first, Bertrand.
Yeah, maybe, of course, there's always a nation where, the concept is quite arbitrary, that at one stage you decide, people, are entitled, to get, extra supports or services and so on, and people who are just, 1 cent above, they don't get it, So it's very difficult, to manage that. I think, the issue would be, as we've shown, I think, just maybe to be a little bit broader in terms of accepting, people who are vulnerable. I mean, we've shown, that people who are between 60 and 70 are as vulnerable that those are below 60. So maybe it means that maybe we should maybe increase maybe some of those thresholds to which, people are entitled to some services and some welfare supports. And I presume, we would capture a much larger group of people that have exactly the same needs than those who are below the threshold but not getting it,
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue that we were just saying at the end there as well is about, tapering of supports and avoiding cliff edges. And our colleagues, Karina Durley and others on the tax welfare team did look at where these, cliff edges are. So where is there a point at which, if you get another euro of income or whatever, then you lose a benefit or entitlement totally. And the system has addressed a lot of those cliff edges, but there are still some in there in the tax and welfare system. So things like medical cards and Stephen mentioned what about back to school allowance or whatever. But so I suppose the key is gradually reducing the supports, so that it's not that an all or nothing approach. I think it's probably a fair way of doing that as well. But as I say, there's still some of those cliff edges in there, and our colleagues' report is very good to highlight where they are.
Thanks, Ellen. Do any of the panelists want to kind of intervene on that question as well, on this balance between people who are maybe close to the thresholds? Naomi?
Yeah, I was going to say, just in the context of budget, often what we see is really welcome increases in some supports. So, for instance, we've had over the last number of years a very welcome increase in national minimum wage, but then we don't see the corresponding threshold rising for the medical card, for instance, or for access to, I think it's for the one parent family payment. You know, the earnings disregard hasn't come up, and what happens is actually an erosion of the benefit that that can have for families. So while it's a slightly different answer to the question that was posed by the participant in the audience, I think that that's really important as well, is that when political decision making, or sorry, policy making is happening around the budget, that we're not just kind of, you know, pulling a string over here but not pulling it down on the other side. So cohesive and cross-government responses to child poverty are really critical, both in terms of investing in income and services, but also ensuring that there's a streamlined approach when providing increases in income.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I think that the work also points to the importance of taking the expenditure side into account as well, particularly when you think of people with disabilities. You know, the same income just doesn't go as far with the extra pressures that they have. And maybe those aren't taken into account so much in, you know, straight means testing on income. Anne-Marie or Stephen? Yeah. So we have two questions then from Grania Collins. The first is on, you tell a very convincing story of families with housing costs, disability costs, and single earnings struggling. But there's a question, what percentage of households are deprived, but these don't apply? And she says she's thinking there on some of the role of insurance and accessible loans. And then she has a second question on equivalence scales, which is obviously how all of these income kind of poverty thresholds are set. So 35 years ago, we settled on 1, 0.66 and 0.33 as the equivalent scale. But in retrospect, was that gendered in the sense that it presupposed two adult families? So would anybody like to take one or other of those?
Yeah, both good questions. Yeah, the issue of who was not included, we didn't actually do the calculation of, you know, doing all of those things at the same time and seeing, you know, what proportion are not yeah, that aren't in households with high housing costs or just above the poverty line, or yeah, so we didn't do that, Grania, but it is something that we could have a look at doing. And there's certainly, yeah, that issue of loans and debt is an issue. So we did see that they that group were quite likely to have arrears, and they were the most likely group to be finding non-housing loans to be a burden. So I think there is an issue there around debt. But no, it's a good question. We could look at who yeah, what proportion are covered by all of those different scenarios. And then, sorry, the second question was
the equivalence scales.
the
Did it sort
equivalent
of
scales.
assume
Yes,
two
yeah,
parent
I think
families?
that's a good point. And I other colleagues have done some work around that about the scales, and it does make a difference what the where you set that scale. I think for the income poverty in particular, there's it probably affects that more than it would affect the deprivation measure, obviously, because the deprivation isn't using those scales. So I think probably that gives us some corrective to it, I suppose. But yeah, there are implications to those choices, and I think we should be aware of what they are.
Okay, and we've another question here from Nessun Vaughan on the age profile of the children in households where deprivation was experienced. I think you touched on this in the presentation, but where did that fall most strongly in? Were there age groups of the children?
Yeah, I was just trying to see if I could find the proportions in each group. But it in terms of the modeling, it wasn't coming out as being particularly, the age of the child wasn't significant for the for this deprived not income poor group. So we that wasn't a particular risk factor. It was coming out for consistent poverty. So we saw that As Naomi mentioned, it's the older children have a higher risk of consistent poverty. So that's the age 12 to 17 group, compared to the youngest age group. So yeah, they're a group where there can be high costs, particularly education costs. I know there was another report out today about from the Competition Authority, interestingly, which was talking about costs of uniforms. But yeah, that it seems to be the older children for consistent poverty, but we weren't finding that pattern, you know, when we're holding everything else constant. So yeah, that's what we find for our group of interest.
Okay, and then there's one question which we might kind of open up to the whole panel as well, which is what's the view on targeted measures for families in deprivation? They may miss out on means tests for some interventions that require income thresholds. So how important is it to remain focused on services that reach children in need?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to come in, but it's just much more difficult, I think, for policymakers to target deprivation versus income. Income is nice and quantifiable and measurable, and we have it in a lot of sources. We have it in our, you know, in administrative data. So it's more difficult to target. I mean, and we do some of it. We target by deprivation within the area. So we do that for the DESH schemes, and I think that's important. You know, it's now been rolled out into, you know, preschool as well, which is important. And now there's going to be a DESH Plus model for schools as well. So I think they're really important initiatives, and things like the SICAP, which I forget what it's the social inclusion and. Don't know if anyone else can help me out, but it's an area-based in social policy interventions that support communities, and I think that's really that's a really important dimension as well.
Thanks, Alan. I think Anne-Marie wanted to come in and contribute on that as well.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, we think about these issues a lot in the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Programme Office. So the report that we wrote last year after the budget, looking at new and increased spending to address child poverty in that budget, outlines 6 principles that policymakers can bear in mind when they're deciding on budget allocations that could help address child poverty. So they include the importance of universal, but also targeted and what we call super targeted measures that would target on particularly disadvantaged children. Also, the importance of not just funding income, but funding services, because over the longer term, it's services like DESH, for example, or Early Start, or the ETCHI program that really do make a difference to the lives of children and help prevent another generation being in poverty or deprivation. And we've also stressed the importance of prevention and early intervention, so that really we would see a very strong role for targeted as well as universal and tapered initiatives. I suppose one thing that I keep wondering is, you know, where do you draw the line? Because nobody has actually known, you know, what is the right balance of targeted and universal. So it's kind of interesting thing to think about that. We can look at more in future. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. Bertrand.
Yes, just want to come back on the issue about, you know, in-kind benefits and in-cash benefits. It's true that, you know, as Helen has mentioned, while we see, you know, we published, you know, just last week, you know, in the budget perspective, you know, study, you know, with our colleagues, you know, Karina and Simona, on the impact of those benefits on child poverty. And what we found is that, you know, while, you know, it's easier, you know, just to measure, you know, the impact of in-cash benefits on income, because it has a direct impact on the level of income. But it's, you know, the impact on deprivation is much lower, so it doesn't translate straight away into reducing the level of deprivation. I presume deprivation, it's something kind of a much more over time that's being built, when in cash, you know, can fluctuate, you know, quite easily, you know, and quite rapidly as well. So in-kind benefits, you know, are of course, you know, very important. You know, all services that can be provided, you know, to poor children, but it won't necessarily have an impact straight away on the level of deprivation.
Okay. Thanks very much. So a couple of other questions coming in. One very good comment here from Gráinne Collins to just make the point that don't forget deprivation can be the result of the lack of intra-household sharing. And I guess that's one area where the data is really limited. We just get everything reported at the household level, but there can be a lot of dynamics internally that can affect the level of services. And then another final question by Colette Deeney on, I agree there should be a lot more universal provision, and a lot of youth services have become very targeted. And she gives the example of the sort of period poverty and the rolling out of free hygiene products in schools. And then a question or a suggestion perhaps more on more support needed for unpaid young carers. And I don't know if that was something that could be picked up at all in the data. Helen or Bertrand?
We didn't look at the issue of caring for someone, so it's not something that we look at. I don't know if we would have enough people maybe in the data just to be able to distinguish that specific group of the population or families. I don't think that we would need more data or more years maybe just to be able to distinguish those groups.
We did a separate study on young carers with the Growing Up in Ireland study. So yeah, and there we were able to look at their outcomes and incomes and things like that as well. So we could put the link up to that one.
Sorry,
I think
Helen.
Martina has dropped out.
Sorry, I lost. That was terrible chairing to lose connection. So building on those last two questions, so maybe I could ask this across our panel. Obviously, the data sometimes limits what researchers can do. We're looking at children in private households in particular, and we don't see those intra-household dynamics. But maybe some of you could comment from your own experiences on groups of children that kind of might be missed here. Obviously, children experiencing homelessness, indirect provision, children in the traveling community. How much of those groups that maybe aren't as well picked up by our survey research? Maybe Naomi first.
Yeah, I certainly think for children living in direct provision, that's a real gap in the data that we have. Certainly, if we were thinking about the issue of at risk of poverty in terms of income, these would be children who have very little access to income. Yet we've seen in the last few budgets that we had a commitment to introduce an international international payment for children living in direct provision, but we haven't actually seen that being fully implemented yet. So I think certainly for those children, we're not really seeing what their experiences are. Just picking up on the issue around services, I might just add a tangential point to that, is that the other thing that I think we're not maybe capturing, I think like the research is just so rich that's being produced by the authors today, but that issue around access to play. And that was kind of something I was going to add in there around services. Well, it's not a service per se. I think it's really critical that we don't just look at income and services, but we also look at children's participation, because we know that when we talk to children, particularly children who are maybe experiencing poverty, the thing that they want most is they want to be able to go and participate in football once a week, or ensure that all children in their class can take part in those activities as well. So I think that that's an area that's worth exploring, and then considering that access to play for children living in direct provision, how limited I suppose that is for them in terms of having access to a safe space to play, or a space to have a play date, etc.
That's actually a great point in terms of quality of children's lives, that it's not just what's inside the family. Stephen, would you like a final word?
In terms of emergency accommodation, children living there, it's well documented just the difficulties that they have growing up in that accommodation, what they are going without. And obviously it echoes what Naomi's just said. In most emergency accommodation, there's no place whatsoever to play, not even within the household, because of the restricted space. In terms of deprivation amongst that group, it's obviously generally very, very heightened. and also the choices as well. So they're experiencing deprivation, but even items they might have or things they do have, their choices of what they can have are extremely limited. So you have no space to store anything. So you can only get so many items of clothing. For example, you may have clothing, but you can only have one coat. You can only have a couple of tracksuits because there's nowhere else to put it. So hugely damaging, over a long period of time, going without items, going without